For decades, it was whispered about like a ghost story. A place where people walked in alive and never walked out. A place so cruel, so inhuman, that even hardened soldiers refused to speak its name. Yet it was real. Hidden behind barbed wire and snow-covered fields, scientists carried out what many historians now call the deadliest experiments ever conducted on human beings, not criminals, not volunteers, ordinary men, women, even children. And the world almost never found out. In the early 1930s, Japan was expanding fast. Its empire stretched across Asia, and its military leaders believed victory depended not just on guns and bombs, but on something far more terrifying: science. If they could weaponize disease itself, they could wipe out entire populations without firing a single bullet. That idea gave birth to a secret program. Officially, it was just a water purification research unit, a harmless medical facility. But behind locked gates, it was something else entirely: a laboratory for human suffering. The compound rose from the frozen plains outside Harbin, massive and isolated. High walls, guard towers, prison blocks, crematoriums. From the air, it looked like a small town. Inside, it was a nightmare. Prisoners arrived by train at night: Chinese civilians, Korean laborers, Russian captives, resistance fighters, sometimes whole families. They were stripped of their names and given a new word instead: logs, like pieces of wood. Disposable. The scientists needed subjects. And to them, these people weren't human anymore. They were materials. Under the leadership of Shiro Ishii, a charismatic army surgeon obsessed with biological warfare, the experiments began. He believed Japan could win wars by turning plague, cholera, and anthrax into weapons. But to perfect these diseases, he needed to see exactly how the human body broke down. So they watched. They measured. They recorded. One prisoner would be tied to a table and injected with bacteria. Doctors stood around calmly, like students in a classroom, noting how long it took for fever to rise, how quickly organs failed. When the screaming stopped, there was no anesthesia. Pain was considered useful data. If someone died too quickly, they called it a failed test. If someone survived longer, that meant progress. Soon, the experiments grew even darker. Vivisections became routine. Prisoners were cut open while still alive so surgeons could study infected organs before decomposition set in. Lungs, livers, brains, removed piece by piece as the victim remained conscious. The goal was pure results. No drugs, no mercy. Outside, winter temperatures dropped far below freezing. Perfect conditions for frostbite studies. Guards forced prisoners to stand naked in the snow, their arms plunged into ice water until the skin turned white and solid like wood. Then researchers smashed the frozen limbs with sticks to hear the sound. If it cracked like ice, it was ready. They tested how long flesh could survive when amputation was necessary, how soldiers might endure cold battlefields. Every scream was labeled science. Diseases were unleashed next. Entire rooms were filled with fleas carrying bubonic plague. Others were infected with cholera-contaminated food. Some were strapped down while bombs filled with bacteria exploded nearby, spraying pathogens into their wounds. It wasn't just observation anymore. It was weapon development. Field tests followed. Planes flew over Chinese villages, dropping infected grain and plague-ridden insects. Within days, entire communities fell sick. Thousands died slowly, without ever knowing they were part of an experiment. And the doctors simply collected the data. Back at the compound, pregnancies were forced between infected prisoners to study how disease passed to unborn children. Infants were born sick, dying within days. Nothing was treated. Nothing was saved. Why now? Death was constant. Smoke rose from the crematoriums day and night. The staff. It became normal. Lunch, breaks, paperwork, coffee, then back to dissecting living people. It wasn't chaos. It was organized, clinical, efficient. That might be the most disturbing part. This wasn't madness. It was planning. By the early 1940s, thousands had already died. Some estimates say 10,000 inside the facility alone. Tens of thousands more from biological attacks outside. Yet almost no one beyond the compound walls knew. Secrecy was absolute. Workers were threatened with execution if they talked. Records were coded. Bodies were burned to ash. But history has a way of breaking through walls. As the war turned against Japan and defeat became inevitable, panic spread through the unit. Orders came down. Destroy everything. Buildings were blown up, documents burned. Remaining prisoners executed, no witnesses. The scientists scattered, changing clothes and identities. Trying to vanish back into civilian life. They thought they had erased the evidence. But survivors spoke. Soviet forces captured several officers and forced confessions. Stories emerged that were so horrific, many people refused to believe them. Newspapers called them exaggerations. Propaganda. Impossible, surely. Doctors couldn't do this, surely humans wouldn't do this, but they had. Then came the most shocking twist of all. Instead of facing war crimes trials, many of the leaders were quietly offered immunity. In exchange for their research data, they would walk free. Information was considered more valuable than justice. The knowledge gained from torture, how diseases spread, how long people survived, was handed over and locked away. The victims' suffering became classified documents. Families never got answers. Names were never recorded. History almost forgot them. For decades, the story remained buried. No textbooks, no memorials, just silence. Only recently have historians and investigators uncovered the full scale of what happened. Mass graves, testimonies, fragments of reports, each piece revealing something colder than war itself. Not rage, not hatred, but indifference, because the true horror isn't just what was done, that it's how easily it was justified. How ordinary people put on lab coats and convinced themselves this was necessary. That's the uncomfortable truth. Monsters aren't always born. Sometimes they're educated, disciplined, promoted. Today, the site is quiet. Grass grows where prison blocks once stood. Wind moves through empty land. If you didn't know the history, you might think nothing ever happened here. But beneath the soil are ashes and stories that refuse to disappear. The deadliest experiment ever conducted on humans wasn't a single test. It was the moment science forgot humanity. And that's a lesson we can't afford to forget, because progress without ethics is just cruelty with better tools.